The weight of the rope. The rope stretched across the cliff face like a lifeline between worlds, the living world below and something else entirely above. Private Tommy Chen watched it sway in the pre-dawn darkness, its fibers already dark with moisture from the Okinawan rain that had been falling since midnight. Somewhere up there, beyond the lip of Hacksaw Ridge, lay the plateau that had swallowed 3 companies in as many days. And somewhere in that darkness, Desmond Doss was preparing to climb back up. "He's lost his mind," Chen whispered to nobody in particular. The words came out as vapor in the cool April air, mixing with the smell of wet canvas and iodine that clung to everything near the aid station. 12 times he's been up that rope tonight. 12! Captain Morrison crouched beside the makeshift pulley system they'd rigged to the cliff face, testing the anchor points one more time. His hands moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that small mistakes killed people. The rope had been their salvation and their curse. Thick manila line salvaged from a destroyed supply depot, strong enough to bear the weight of wounded men being lowered through 150 feet of empty air. But every trip up weakened it. Every descent frayed it a little more. "Doss!" Morrison called softly toward the base of the cliff. "You don't have to keep going up there." The medic emerged from the shadows where he'd been checking his aid bag one final time. Even in the dim light, Chen could see the exhaustion etched into Doss's face, the way his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the harness around his waist. 12 round trips up that rope. 12 wounded men lowered to safety, while Japanese positions on the ridge remained active, waiting. "There's still voices up there, sir," Doss replied, his Virginia accent soft but unwavering. "Can't leave them." The M3 grease gun lay in pieces beside the rope anchor, its frame twisted beyond recognition after serving as an improvised stretcher support throughout the night. What had once been an instrument of war now looked more like abstract sculpture. Bent metal shaped by desperation and the weight of human bodies. Chen stared at it, trying to reconcile the weapon he'd been trained to use with this broken thing that had somehow saved lives instead of taking them. Dr. Reynolds looked up from the wounded soldier he was treating, his surgical mask pulled down around his neck. "Doss, you've been climbing for 8 hours. Your body—" "My body's fine, Doc." But as Doss reached for the rope, Chen saw him pause, saw the way he closed his eyes for just a moment. Not exhaustion, prayer. Always prayer with this one. The attack on Hacksaw Ridge had begun 3 days ago with the confidence that came from superior numbers and firepower. The 77th Infantry Division had taken worse positions than this throughout the Pacific campaign, but the ridge had taught them the difference between taking ground and holding it. The Japanese had turned the Coral Plateau into a maze of connected caves and tunnels, transforming every advance into a deadly puzzle where the enemy could appear anywhere. Chen remembered the moment everything had changed. They'd reached the top, spread out across the plateau, and for 20 minutes it had felt like victory. Then the mortars had started falling, coordinated machine gun fire from positions they couldn't see, and suddenly the ridge became a trap. The retreat order had come through the chaos of radio static and screaming, but in the confusion, wounded men had been left behind. That's when Doss had looked at the rope, their escape route off the plateau, and decided it could work in reverse. "The Japanese pulled back to their night positions," Morrison said, studying the cliff face above them. "But they'll be watching for movement. If they see you up there, they've had chances to cut this rope all night," Doss replied, testing his grip. "Something's keeping them from doing it." Chen had his own theory about that. Word was getting around, even among enemy forces, about the American medic who kept coming back. Some of the prisoners they'd taken had mentioned him, the one who wouldn't carry a weapon, who treated their wounded too when he found them. Maybe respect, maybe curiosity, maybe just the exhausted recognition that some fights transcended nationality. The rope creaked as Doss began his 13th ascent. Chen watched until the medic's silhouette disappeared over the lip of the ridge, swallowed by the darkness above. Then came the waiting, the longest part of every trip, when all they could do was listen for gunfire and pray the rope wouldn't suddenly go slack. "How many more?" Chen asked. Morrison checked his watch. "Dawn in 90 minutes. After that..." He didn't need to finish. After dawn, the ridge would become a killing field again, and no amount of courage would make that climb survivable. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like thunder that wouldn't end. The battle for Okinawa stretched across the entire southern end of the island. But here on this cliff face, the war had narrowed to one fraying rope and one man's refusal to stop climbing it. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The voices reached Doss before he could see anything. Weak calls scattered across the plateau like echoes of a prayer half-remembered. "Medic, over here, please." Each one pulled at him from a different direction, mapping the geography of pain that covered the top of Hacksaw Ridge. He'd emerged from his climb into a world transformed by 8 hours of night rain. The coral and limestone that formed the ridge's foundation had become slick and treacherous, pooling water in shell craters that reflected distant flares like broken mirrors. The smell hit him immediately, cordite and wet earth, but underneath it, something else. The metallic scent that meant too many wounded men had been lying here too long. Private Jackson lay wedged between two chunks of blasted coral, conscious but shaking with shock. Doss had found him on the 6th trip, but hadn't been able to move him then, not with the others bleeding more severely. Now Jackson's eyes tracked Doss's movement with the desperate awareness of a man who'd been listening to footsteps all night, wondering if they belonged to salvation or something else. "Knew you'd come back," Jackson whispered as Doss knelt beside him. "Kept telling myself, Doss, don't leave nobody." The medic's hands moved automatically, checking pulse and breathing while his eyes adjusted to the deeper darkness of the plateau. This close to the Japanese positions, even a whispered conversation felt dangerous. But Jackson needed to talk, needed to believe in something beyond the pain radiating from his shattered leg. "How many more?" Jackson asked. "Just you," Doss lied smoothly, though he'd already identified at least 2 other voices calling from different sectors of the ridge. The lie was a kindness. Jackson didn't need to know he might have to wait while others were evacuated first. Didn't need to carry that weight along with everything else. Working by touch in the darkness, Doss splinted Jackson's leg using pieces of broken timber and strips torn from his own shirt. The makings of the improvised stretcher lay nearby, canvas salvaged from destroyed equipment, rope ends, and the twisted remains of what had once been various pieces of military gear. The M3's bent frame had finally given out on the previous trip, but its sacrifice had taught him how to improvise load-bearing supports from whatever the ridge provided. A flare burst overhead, casting harsh shadows across the plateau for 30 seconds. In that brief illumination, Doss saw them, movement among the cave mouths that marked Japanese positions. Not advancing, just watching. He pressed himself flat against the coral, pulling Jackson down with him, waiting for the darkness to return. "They could have cut your rope," Jackson said when the flare died. "Why haven't they?" Doss had wondered the same thing. 12 trips up that cliff, 12 descents with wounded men, and the rope remained intact. Maybe tactical considerations. Cutting it might provoke artillery strikes on their positions. Maybe something else entirely. "Don't know," he replied, beginning the careful process of moving Jackson toward the cliff edge. "Right now, I'm just grateful." The improvised stretcher held together better than he'd expected, distributing Jackson's weight across a frame made from broken rifle stocks and communication wire. But every step across the slick coral tested both the equipment and Doss's endurance. His legs shook with exhaustion, his hands burned from rope friction, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice kept asking how many more times he could make this climb. They reached the rope anchor just as another voice called from the opposite end of the plateau, clear and urgent. Someone else who'd been waiting, hoping, measuring time by the sound of distant footsteps. Jackson heard it too. "Go," he said as Doss hesitated. "I can wait. That one sounds... I'm getting you down first." The words came out harder than Doss intended, carrying 8 hours of accumulated stress. "Then I'll come back." The descent took 25 minutes. Jackson's weight on the stretcher made every foot of rope feel uncertain, every gust of wind a potential disaster. Halfway down, the stretcher began to spin, and Doss had to use his own body as a stabilizer, pressing against the cliff face while Jackson fought waves of nausea and vertigo. Captain Morrison was waiting at the bottom with Dr. Reynolds and 2 orderlies. They moved with the efficient silence of men who'd done this 12 times already tonight, transferring Jackson to a proper stretcher without words. But Doss saw the way Morrison looked at the rope, checking it for signs of failure, calculating odds. "The anchor points are holding," Morrison said quietly, "but the rope itself..." Doss followed his gaze. Even in the dim light, the fraying was visible. Individual fibers separating under repeated stress, the thick manila line gradually becoming something more tenuous. Maybe good for 2 more trips. Maybe 1. Maybe none. "There's at least 2 more up there," Doss said. "Doss!" Morrison's voice carried the weight of command and something else, personal concern for a soldier who'd already given more than anyone had a right to ask. "If that rope fails, then I find another way down." The medic was already checking his aid bag, redistributing supplies, preparing for what might be his final ascent. Behind him, Jackson was being loaded into an ambulance. The 13th man saved, but not the last who needed saving. Chen watched from the aid station, still trying to process what he'd witnessed throughout the night. 13 separate climbs up a fraying rope into enemy territory. 13 wounded men lowered to safety through pure determination and improvised engineering. And now Doss was preparing to climb again. "You ever see anything like this?" Chen asked Dr. Reynolds. The doctor paused in his work, surgical instruments still in his hands. "In medical school, they teach you about the limits of human endurance," he said quietly. "Tonight, I'm learning they teach you wrong." The 14th ascent felt different from the first 13. The rope seemed thinner in Doss's hands, its fibers spreading under his grip like something alive and dying. Each pull upward sent vibrations through the line that hadn't been there before, subtle warnings that physics was catching up with faith. Private Martinez heard him coming before Doss reached the top. "That you, medic?" The voice carried across the plateau from somewhere near the abandoned machine gun nest that had been overrun during the initial assault. Young voice, scared but trying not to show it. "It's me," Doss called softly as he pulled himself over the lip of the ridge. "Where are you hurt?" "Shrapnel in my shoulder and something wrong with my ribs. Been lying here since the pullback, listening to you work. Counted 12 trips. No, 13 now." Doss found Martinez propped against the base of a destroyed tree, conscious and alert despite the dark stains on his uniform. This one would be easier to move than some of the others. Mobile enough to assist with his own evacuation, though the rib injury meant careful handling during the descent. As Doss worked, Martinez talked. Not from pain or fear, but from the need to make sense of what he'd witnessed throughout the night. "My squad leader told me you won't carry a rifle," he said. "That true?" "That's true. But you keep coming up here anyway." Doss paused in his bandaging. The question carried weight beyond simple curiosity, the kind of moral puzzle that soldiers wrestled with in quiet moments between firefights. "Can't help anybody from down below," he said finally. "You scared?" The honesty of the question deserved an honest answer. "Every time I grab that rope..." Martinez nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Good. Means you're thinking straight." He helped Doss apply a pressure bandage to his shoulder wound, their movements coordinated by necessity and 8 hours of practice. "You know what the Japanese are calling you?" "What's that?" "Tenno no Isha, the Emperor's doctor. Heard it from a prisoner we took yesterday. Story is you've been treating their wounded too when you find them mixed up with ours." Doss didn't respond immediately. It was true, though not something he'd talked about. Wounded was wounded. Nationality seemed like a small consideration when someone was bleeding out on coral rock, but hearing it spoken aloud, especially by someone who'd been lying in the darkness thinking about it all night, felt like an admission of something he wasn't sure he was ready to discuss. They moved slowly toward the rope anchor, Martinez mobile enough to walk, but leaning heavily on Doss for support. The plateau around them remained eerily quiet, not the silence of abandonment, but the watchful quiet of held breath. Japanese positions were active, observers certainly tracking their movement, yet no shots were fired. "Why aren't they shooting at us?" Martinez asked. "I've been wondering the same thing." As they reached the cliff edge, another voice called from the far end of the plateau, stronger than Martinez had been, but urgent with a different kind of desperation. The kind of call that meant time was running out for someone. Martinez heard it too. While Doss rigged the stretcher system for their descent, the private stared across the plateau toward the source of the voice. "Sounds like Peterson," he said. "We got separated during the pullback, thought he made it down. I'll get him after I get you down." "Doss!" Martinez grabbed the medic's arm as they prepared for descent. "That rope's not going to hold much longer, is it?" The question hung in the rain-soaked air between them. Below, Captain Morrison and the aid station crew were waiting with their practiced efficiency, ready to receive another wounded soldier. Above, Peterson's voice carried across the plateau with increasing urgency, and here on the cliff edge, a fraying rope represented the difference between rescue and disaster. "We'll see," Doss said. The descent began smoothly enough. Martinez proved to be an ideal patient, conscious, cooperative, able to help stabilize the stretcher during the long drop through empty air. But halfway down, Doss felt it. A subtle change in the rope's behavior, a slight give that hadn't been there before. Individual strands were beginning to separate under load. They reached bottom safely but barely. Morrison was there immediately, examining the rope with the focused intensity of an engineer calculating failure rates. "That's it," he said quietly. "One more trip and this line snaps." Dr. Reynolds looked up from examining Martinez. "How many more up there?" "At least one, maybe two." "Doss, you can't—" "I can rig a new line." The medic was already calculating alternatives, studying the cliff face for anchor points. "Give me 30 minutes and some fresh rope." "We don't have 30 minutes, Morrison replied, checking his watch. "Dawn in 45 minutes. After that, this becomes a suicide mission." The weight of mathematics settled over the aid station like the smell of rain on coral. 13 men saved, but at least one still calling from the darkness above. A rope that might hold for one more trip, or might not. And somewhere in the growing grey of pre-dawn, Japanese positions that had remained mysteriously inactive throughout the night. Chen watched Doss's face in the lamplight, seeing the calculation playing out behind exhausted eyes. Not tactical calculation, moral arithmetic. The kind of math that weighed certain risk against possible salvation, personal safety against the voice calling Peterson across an abandoned plateau. "What if they're waiting?" Chen asked. "What if they let you work all night just to trap you up there when you can't get down?" Martinez, being loaded onto a stretcher, turned his head toward Doss. "You saved 14 of us," he said. "That's enough. That's more than enough." But Doss was already checking his aid bag again, already preparing for what everyone else recognized as an impossible choice. Somewhere above, Peterson's voice continued to call across the plateau, not for help anymore, but simply calling names, trying to find out if anyone else was still alive up there. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take. And share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope felt different in Doss's hands as he began what everyone knew would be the final ascent. Each fiber seemed to speak individually, some still strong, others stretching toward their breaking point, the whole line becoming less than the sum of its parts. Captain Morrison had given him a direct order to wait for dawn and a fresh assault with proper equipment. Doss had nodded respectfully and started climbing anyway. Peterson's voice guided him across the plateau like a lighthouse beacon, but it was weaker now, less frequent. When Doss finally found him, the soldier was wedged in a shell crater 20 feet from the cliff edge, conscious but pale with blood loss from a wound in his abdomen that had been bleeding slowly for hours. "I knew somebody would come," Peterson whispered as Doss slid into the crater beside him. "Kept hearing you working all night. Martinez make it down?" "Safe at the aid station." "Good. Good." Peterson tried to sit up, then thought better of it. "How many you bring down total?" "You'll be 14. 14. Peterson repeated the number like he was trying to memorize it. 14 guys who get to go home because one medic wouldn't quit. Doss was already working, assessing the abdominal wound by touch in the pre-dawn darkness. Serious, but not immediately fatal, assuming they could get Peterson down the cliff and to a proper surgical facility within the next hour. The makeshift stretcher would have to be especially stable for this one. Any jarring during descent could turn a survivable wound into something worse. As he worked, Doss became aware of movement around the crater's rim. Not threatening, more like observers gathering for something they wanted to witness. Japanese soldiers positioned close enough to intervene, but maintaining careful distance. In the growing grey of dawn, he could see them more clearly than he had all night. "They're watching us," Peterson said. "I know. Why aren't they shooting?" Doss paused in his bandaging, looking up at the ring of soldiers around their position. Young faces mostly, exhausted by the same night that had worn down the Americans, but alert, focused, waiting for something he couldn't identify. One of them, a sergeant by his bearing, stepped closer to the crater's edge. He said something in Japanese, pointing at Doss, then at Peterson, then toward the cliff edge. The tone was respectful, almost formal. "What's he saying?" Peterson asked. "Don't know." But Doss had a feeling it wasn't a threat. Something in the soldier's posture, the way the others gathered around him, suggested ceremony rather than confrontation, recognition of something that transcended the temporary boundaries of war. The stretcher construction went faster this time, muscle memory guiding his hands through the process of creating load-bearing supports from broken equipment and salvaged rope. But as they prepared to move toward the cliff edge, the Japanese sergeant spoke again, longer this time, clearly addressing Doss directly. Another soldier translated in broken English. He says, "You are good doctor. You help all wounded, yes? Japanese wounded too?" Doss nodded slowly. It was true, though not something he'd expected to become significant. Throughout the night he'd occasionally found enemy soldiers among the American wounded, men caught in the same artillery strikes that had devastated his own unit. Wounded was wounded. The translator continued. He says, "Rope is weak. We know this. We watch all night. You want new rope." The offer hung in the morning air, like something impossible. Enemy soldiers proposing to help evacuate an American wounded man because they respected the medic's treatment of their own casualties. Peterson stared up at Doss, waiting to see how he would respond. "Yes," Doss said finally. "New rope would help." What followed was the strangest collaboration of Doss's military experience. Japanese soldiers produced climbing rope from their own equipment, showing him anchor points they'd been using for their own supply operations. Working together with hand signals and shared understanding of basic engineering principles, they rigged a secondary line alongside the original, not trusting it entirely, but creating redundancy that might prevent disaster if the Manila line failed. The descent began just as full dawn broke over Okinawa. Peterson, stable on the improved stretcher, talking quietly to stay conscious during the long drop. Doss managing both ropes, feeling the way the new line took most of the load while the old one provided backup support. Halfway down, Peterson said something that would stay with Doss for the rest of his life. "You know they'll never put this in the official report. Japanese soldiers helping evacuate an American wounded. Probably not. But it happened anyway. It happened. They reached bottom safely, the 14th successful evacuation of the night. Captain Morrison was waiting with questions in his eyes and relief on his face, but before he could speak, something made them all look up. On the ridge above, silhouetted against the morning sky, Japanese soldiers were visible at the cliff edge, watching. One of them, the sergeant, raised his hand in what could only be interpreted as a farewell salute. Dr. Reynolds took charge of Peterson, beginning the process of preparing him for immediate surgical evacuation. But his eyes kept returning to the cliff above, trying to process what he'd witnessed. "In my after-action report," he said quietly, "I'm going to have trouble explaining this." Doss collapsed against a supply crate, finally allowing exhaustion to overtake him. 14 men evacuated. A night that had begun with fraying rope and impossible choices had ended with something he couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe, or temporary peace between people who understood that some things mattered more than the uniforms they wore. Chen approached with a canteen of water, studying Doss's face in the morning light. "How do you feel?" It was a simple question that demanded a complex answer. How did you feel after discovering that courage could be shared across enemy lines? After learning that a fraying rope could hold more weight than physics suggested when other hands helped bear the load? "Grateful," Doss said finally. "Just grateful." Above them, the Japanese soldiers had withdrawn from the cliff edge, disappearing back into their positions. Soon, the battle for Hacksaw Ridge would resume with fresh assaults and renewed violence. But for now, in the growing warmth of morning sun, 14 wounded Americans were alive because one medic had refused to accept impossible as an answer. 3 months after Hacksaw Ridge, Doss sat in a military hospital in Hawaii, staring at the citation that would accompany his Medal of Honor. The official language was precise and clean. Private First Class Desmond Doss distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism in action on the Maida Escarpment, Okinawa, when he saved the lives of at least 75 wounded soldiers during a fierce battle. 75. The number had grown with each retelling, each official report building on the previous one, until the night on the ridge had become something larger than memory. Doss set the citation aside and picked up the letter he'd been trying to write to his wife Dorothy for 3 days. A letter that would explain what the medal couldn't capture. "Dear Dorothy," he wrote, then stopped. "How do you tell someone that the bravest thing you did was also the most terrifying? That the night they're calling heroic was filled with moments when you wanted nothing more than to quit climbing that rope and let someone else carry the weight?" The truth was smaller and more complicated than the citation suggested. 14 men, not 75. One night, not a sustained battle. A fraying rope that should have failed but didn't. Enemy soldiers who chose mercy over tactics, and a decision that felt less like heroism than simple inability to walk away from voices calling for help. Nurse Patricia Williams knocked on the doorframe of his room. "You have visitors." Captain Morrison entered, followed by Private Chen and 3 other soldiers Doss recognized from the aid station. They moved with the careful formality of men who'd rehearsed this moment, each carrying something that made their purpose clear. "Doss." Morrison's voice carried the same weight it had carried that night on the cliff. "We wanted to talk to you before the ceremony tomorrow." Chen stepped forward, holding a piece of manila rope. Thick, frayed, stained with coral dust and something darker. "We brought this down after the battle," he said. "The rope. What was left of it." Doss took the rope segment, feeling its weight, remembering the way it had felt in his hands during those hours of climbing and descent. The fibers were separated now, individual strands visible where stress had begun to tear the line apart. Another trip or two, and it would have failed completely. "We've been talking," Morrison continued, "about what happened that night, about what goes in the official reports and what doesn't. The Japanese soldiers," Chen said, "the ones who helped rig the second line. Command doesn't want that in the record." Doss nodded. He'd expected as much. Military bureaucracy didn't handle complexity well, especially complexity that suggested enemy soldiers might sometimes choose humanity over tactics. The official version would be cleaner, more suitable for citations and newspaper stories. "But we remember," said Private Rodriguez, one of the aid station medics. All of us who were there that night, we remember how it really happened. They sat in the hospital room's afternoon sunlight, 5 men who'd shared something that would never quite translate into words. Morrison pulled out a flask and poured small measures of whiskey into paper cups, a violation of hospital rules that felt necessary anyway. "To Peterson," Morrison said, raising his cup, "and Martinez, and Jackson, and all the others who made it home. And to the sergeant up there who threw us that rope," Chen added quietly. They drank in silence, each man carrying his own version of that night. For Doss, the memories came in fragments. The feel of coral under his hands, the weight of wounded men on improvised stretchers, the moment when enemy soldiers had chosen to help rather than hinder. Details too small for citations, but too important to forget. "What are you going to tell people?" Rodriguez asked. "When they ask you about it?" Doss considered the question. "Tomorrow there would be a ceremony, photographers, official speeches about heroism and duty. The president would hang a medal around his neck while cameras recorded the moment for posterity. But tonight, in this hospital room with these men, there was space for something closer to truth. "I'm going to tell them about the rope," he said finally. "About how it held when it shouldn't have, and how sometimes help comes from places you don't expect." Morrison finished his whiskey and stood to leave. "The citation says 75 men," he said. "You and I both know it was 14 that night. But you know what? Somewhere in the Pacific, there's probably 75 families who have their sons home because of what you did on various ridges, various nights. Numbers don't always tell the right story, but sometimes they tell a true one anyway." After the others left, Doss returned to his letter. The afternoon sun was fading, casting long shadows across the hospital room floor. Outside, he could hear the sounds of Honolulu harbor, ships coming and going, carrying soldiers home from the war that was finally ending. "Dear Dorothy," he wrote again, "tomorrow they're giving me a medal for something that happened on a ridge in Okinawa. The citation talks about heroism, but I want you to know what it really was. A night when I couldn't stop climbing a rope because there were voices calling for help, and sometimes help came from the strangest places." He paused, thinking about how to explain the weight of carrying 14 lives down a cliff face, the way enemy soldiers had chosen mercy over military advantage. The sound a rope makes when it's stretched beyond its design limits, but somehow holds anyway. "The rope should have broken," he continued. "Physics said it should have failed after the 4th or 5th trip, but it held because other hands helped carry the load. Some American, some Japanese, all of us just trying to get wounded men home safely. That's what I'll remember when they put this medal around my neck tomorrow. Not the heroism they'll talk about in the ceremony, but the moment when war became smaller than human decency." He signed the letter and sealed it, then sat holding the piece of frayed rope Chen had brought him. 14 men, one night, a length of manila line that had become something more than the sum of its fibers when people chose to help rather than hinder. Tomorrow there would be speeches about extraordinary heroism. Tonight there was only the memory of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, because the alternative, walking away from voices calling for help, was simply impossible to live with. 20 years after Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond Doss stood in his garage in Lynchburg, Virginia, holding a length of manila rope his hands remembered better than his eyes. The arthritis in his fingers, a gift from those nights of climbing and lowering wounded men, made the simple act of gripping rope a reminder of everything his body had carried since the war. His grandson Timothy, home from school and full of questions about the Medal of Honor hanging in the living room, watched as Doss tested the rope's strength with movements that were more muscle memory than conscious thought. "Granddad, why do you keep that old rope?" The question was innocent, but it pulled Doss back across 2 decades to a cliff face in Okinawa, to the weight of 14 lives, to the moment when enemy soldiers had chosen mercy over tactics. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that some objects become repositories for entire nights of fear and faith and impossible choices? Sometimes things hold more than their own weight. Doss said finally, coiling the rope with careful precision. This rope. It carried more than it should have been able to carry. The arthritis flared as he worked, joints protesting movements they'd made hundreds of times during the war. But the pain was familiar now, an old companion that marked the difference between the young medic who'd climbed that cliff and the older man who still woke sometimes to the sound of voices calling medic, across a plateau that existed now only in memory. Through the garage window, he could see Dorothy hanging laundry on the line behind their house, white shirts and blue dresses dancing in the Virginia breeze. Normal life, domestic rhythms, the kind of peaceful routine he'd dreamed about during those nights when peace seemed like something that belonged to other people in other worlds. "Did you really save 75 men?" Timothy asked. The number from the citation, the official count that had grown in the retelling until it bore only passing resemblance to the reality of one fraying rope and 14 individual descents through rain-soaked darkness. Doss had stopped correcting the number years ago, not because it was accurate, but because accuracy wasn't always the same thing as truth. "I helped 14 men get down from a ridge one night," he said. "But there were other nights, other ridges. The numbers are complicated in war." What he didn't tell Timothy was about the letter that had arrived 3 months ago, written in careful English by a Japanese veteran named Sergeant Yamamoto, who'd tracked down Doss's address through veteran organizations and mutual acquaintances. A letter that began, "You probably don't remember me, but I was the soldier who helped rig the second rope line that night on the ridge." The letter had sat on Doss's kitchen table for a week before he could bring himself to open it completely. Yamamoto had written about his own memories of that night, about the decision his unit had made to help rather than hinder the evacuation, about the years since when he'd wondered what had happened to the American medic who treated wounded without regard for the uniforms they wore. "I've spent 20 years trying to understand why we helped you that night," Yamamoto had written. "I think now it was because we recognized something in what you were doing that was larger than the war we were fighting. You showed us that it was possible to choose mercy even in the middle of something terrible." The letter had ended with an invitation. Yamamoto would be traveling to the United States on business next month and hoped they might meet. 2 old soldiers sharing memories of a night when enemies had briefly become something else. Doss had written back immediately, agreeing to the meeting and thanking Yamamoto for reaching out. Some conversations, he'd learned, could wait 20 years and still be worth having. Granddad. Timothy was staring at him with the focused attention of children who sense adult thoughts traveling to places they can't follow. "Are you okay?" "Just remembering," Doss replied, securing the rope on its wall hook next to other tools that had found second lives in civilian peace. "Sometimes memory gets heavy." As they walked back toward the house, Timothy asked the question Doss had been expecting. "Were you scared that night?" "Every minute. But you kept going anyway. Couldn't stop. There were voices calling for help, and I had a rope that might hold one more time." Inside the house, Dorothy was preparing dinner, moving through the kitchen with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to create normal life in the spaces between a veteran's difficult memories. She looked up as they entered, reading Doss's face with the practiced skill of a woman who'd been married to a war hero long enough to know the difference between the public story and the private wait. "You showed him the rope again?" she asked. He asked about it. She nodded, understanding that some artifacts demanded regular attention, regular handling, regular remembrance of the weight they represented. The Medal of Honor hung in the living room for visitors to see, but the rope stayed in the garage where Doss could touch it when memory demanded physical proof that impossible things had really happened. That evening, after Timothy had gone home and Dorothy was reading in the living room, Doss sat on his back porch watching clouds gather over the Virginia mountains. Tomorrow he would meet Yamamoto at a restaurant in Lynchburg, 2 old soldiers sharing coffee and attempting to bridge 20 years of wondering about that night on the ridge. The arthritis in his hands flared again, reminding him of rope burn and cliff faces and the weight of wounded men on improvised stretchers, but also reminding him of the moment when enemy hands had helped bear that weight, when war had become smaller than human decency, when a fraying rope had held because people had chosen to help rather than hinder. In his jacket pocket, he carried Yamamoto's letter and his own response. Two pieces of paper that represented the part of the story that would never make it into official histories. The part about mercy transcending uniform, about enemies choosing humanity over tactics, about the weight that heroes carry long after the ceremony's end and the cameras stop recording. 75 men, the citation read. But Doss knew the real number was both smaller and larger than that. 14 men lowered from a ridge one night, but also the ripple effect of choosing mercy over violence, of refusing to let impossible become an excuse for inaction. The rope had held. That was what mattered. When it should have failed, when physics said it couldn't bear another load, when every rational calculation suggested stopping, the rope had held because other hands had helped carry the weight. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.